Welcome back to another video inside the Sports Speed Insider with yours truly, Sam Portland. So one thing, I've had a few messages sort of this point as well. If you haven't got a copy of the Sports Speed system, get yourself a copy of that because it works so well with everything that we do, and it's a really good reference guide for you to continually keep flicking and picking everything that you're doing. So from the last class, we actually looked at creating intensity without load. Now we're starting to look at how do we create intensity with load. Now, again, we sort of myth bust that the notion of adding load is not necessarily adding external load. So obviously we have the creation of internal load, we have the utilization of different things to create intensity. And I think an asset for any team sports speed coach, any sports speed coach, is the understanding of loading and the loading parameters. I really truly believe that it is a thing that is, it's just not spoke about. It is not talked about clearly. It is not driven in a direction that is conducive to our industry. Talking about the role and the relationship of using external load with sprinting, it becomes a really cool question to ask. And as a recap, as we spoke about on the last call that we had and the last coaching session, using to create the first progresses and the first increases in speed training for team sport athletes, you do not need to use any external load, because the number one problem most team sport athletes have as they go through their development of speed is a complete misunderstanding of their inherent ability to use the force that they have previously attained. Remember, we've always discussed that when we use general means of training, such as the weight room, we're developing largely non-specific force that doesn't transfer to a great degree towards moving at high speeds and high motor skill, which is the sport task in itself. So what actually tends to happen is we get this, the stronger we get in those exercises, and the better we actually get in those exercises, the worse we become in our sport and the worse we become in improving our speed. So when we take a look at some of the ideas that we first started in the session last week on the Sports Speed Insider, we started to look at when someone is in their initial phases of training, the learn to sprint phases of training, the progressive movement skills that we need are so simple. We're using running drill variations, we're using wall drills variations, we're developing our plyometric and jumping ability, our bouncing, our bounds, and our wall drills, because they're the most untapped resource. And again, when we're considering loading inside the strength and conditioning community, when we talk about the loading of running to create velocity, no one talks about this because it's very difficult. Because in order to be successful at loading your athletes, you need to understand how we create load within our athletes and within your athletes. So in that learning to sprint phase, someone who their speed age is learning to sprint, they've got less than 2 years of really targeted training, really targeted, deliberate restructuring, as in the sports speed system, towards developing speed as the most important part, which then enhances our ability to practice the sport. So we can practice the sport, so we can then play the sport really well. We get so many gains out of doing two really simple things. We reduce the gym volume by half straight off the bat, and we replace that volume with more specific training. It's the simplest thing that you can do. And then we start to use our submaximal sprint variations. My speed gate goal philosophy is so powerful and so effective. It's submaximal loading, because we are creating and intersecting within the gap of force and rate of force development with ground contact and and obviously specific motor task of sprinting. So we're intersecting that gap that can't be found, even that gap that can't be traced with depth jumps and high intensity plyometrics uh, cannot be tapped into without sprinting or sprint variations. And then we use our long build-ups and we use our speed build-ups. And with inside our speed build-ups, we're focusing on loading the 4 to 5 steps at the given percentage that we want to achieve, circa 80%. And you do this a lot. We've got a lot of data inside my programs and stuff that suggest that running at 80% of maximum sprint speed and accumulating ground contacts at that for a majority of team sport athletes is going to improve their ability. I had an athlete this week. He's running 30 to 40 meter flies at 1.2 seconds consistently over the last 3 weeks, and he is producing more of them, and he is producing them easier. What does that tell you? Adaptation, specific adaptation to the imposed demands. And guess what's coming next? As soon as we get to intensify that, he will be dropping a 1.1 and below 30 to 40 meter sprint time, which is going to put him at approximately a 10 meters per second mark. These are the things that we need to know. So when we've transferred out of that and we start to use overload, okay, the overload is created by the intensification of speed. So making speed harder, making speed faster. Okay, that's the first way in creating overload in running. Really simple, because you can't progress sprinting like you can progress intensity inside the gym or a weight room exercise, because you just keep adding more and doing less reps. That progressive overload approach, where in speed we need to run faster for greater distances at higher intensities. So it's the complete sort of opposite that you'll find. So when we're looking at overload, let's take the easiest example that is understood in our learning to sprint phases. Our initial athletes, when we start to use resisted sled work for the different phases of acceleration, the 3 phases of acceleration, we've got an initial acceleration, so from static to movement, early acceleration, and then late acceleration. Okay, so late acceleration is going to go all the way up to 20 meters, maybe a bit more, because we're going to get a drop off of acceleration the faster we get, because velocity is going to increase. So when we start looking at how we add that, well, with our athletes are really strong in the gym, but they're slow on the field, we need to just give them lots of time. So the heavier the sled that we can give them, the better it's going to do for them, because it's going to start shifting the way that we produce force, the previously attained force that we have, within the dynamic correspondence needed. So within the specific skill. So we've squatted heavy, but now we need to accelerate heavy under heavy loads. And that's a really simple key thing to understand. So first step, get a sled or get a prowler and push it as heavy as you can until the mechanics break down. Then you want to take that load and you want to overload that. So how do we overload that? If you've got 100 kilos on a prowler, you want to push that 100 kilos as hard, as fast as you can. And you also then want to be able to accelerate that. So the technical KPI that we want to see when we're doing heavy resisted accelerations is that we overcome the inertia. The sled starts accelerating itself. That means we've completed and we've beat the load, essentially. Then to create further overload of that, what we're actually doing to create further overload of that, we want to reduce the weight to increase the velocity to try and maintain the technical capabilities that the athletes are showing, and improve and enhance on the way in which that is conducted, essentially how we produce the movement and how we do the movements. And that's done with prowler variations, pulley variations, sled variations, banded variations, and vest variations. Now, there's a thing to consider just as we wrap up on the Sports Speed Insider today. Just as we wrap up, when we're using bands, we have to understand that it places a very different type of force on the athlete. It's a very active kinetic So if we're resisting against bands, it is pulling us back into the ground. So we have to understand the way that we're using them a little bit more sparingly. So sometimes when you're using bands, if you've got pre-existing Achilles injuries or anything tenderness related, you start hitting those bands and the body starts going, hang on a minute. Hang on a minute. I'm not too happy with this. So that's it for today on the Sports Speed Insider. Next week, we're going to start looking at the next stage of running with overload and looking at ways in which we can start to use assisted variations earlier on in the training process to help produce our athletes. So stay tuned for the next call. Remember to implement, dive in, drive on, and keep developing your sports.